Chapter 5 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 10. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 10, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 5, Blair's Mexican Project. The triumphant re-election of Mr. Lincoln in November 1864 greatly simplified the political conditions as well as the military prospects of the country. Decisive popular majorities had pointedly rebuked the individuals who proclaimed and the party which had resolved that the war was a failure. The verdict of the ballot box not only decided the continuance of a war administration and a war policy, but renewed the assurance of a public sentiment to sustain its prosecution. When Congress convened on the 6th of December and the President transmitted to that body his annual message, he included in his comprehensive review of public affairs a temperate but strong and terse statement of this fact and its potent significance. Inspired by this majestic manifestation of the popular will to preserve the Union and maintain the Constitution, he was able to speak of the future with hope and confidence. But with characteristic prudence and good taste, he uttered no word of boasting and indulged in no syllable of acrimony. On the contrary, in terms of fatherly kindness, he again offered the rebellious states the generous conditions he had previously tendered them by various acts and declarations, and specifically in his amnesty proclamation of December 8, 1863. The statement of the whole situation, with its alternative issues, was so admirably compressed into the closing paragraphs of his message as to leave no room for ignorance or misunderstanding. The national resources, then, are unexhausted, and, as we believe, inexhaustible. The public purpose to reestablish and maintain the national authority is unchanged, and, as we believe, unchangeable. The manner of continuing the effort remains to choose. On careful consideration of all the evidence accessible, it seems to me that no attempt at negotiation with the insurgent leader could result in any good. He would accept nothing short of severance of the Union, precisely what we will not and cannot give. His declarations to this effect are explicit and oft repeated. He does not attempt to deceive us. He affords us no excuse to deceive ourselves. He cannot voluntarily re-accept the Union. We cannot voluntarily yield it. Between him and us the issue is distinct, simple, and inflexible. It is an issue which can only be tried by war and decided by victory. If we yield, we are beaten. If the Southern people fail him, he is beaten. Either way, it would be the victory and defeat following war. What is true, however, of him who heads the insurgent cause is not necessarily true of those who follow. Although he cannot re-accept the Union, they can. Some of them, we know, already desire peace and reunion. The number of such may increase. They can at any moment have peace simply by laying down their arms and submitting to the national authority under the Constitution. After so much, the government could not, if it would, maintain war against them. The loyal people would not sustain or allow it. If questions should remain, we would adjust them by the peaceful means of legislation, conference, courts, and votes, operating only in constitutional and lawful channels. Some certain and other possible questions are and would be beyond the executive power to adjust, as for instance the admission of members into Congress and whatever might require the appropriation of money. The executive power itself would be greatly diminished by the cessation of actual war. Pardons and remissions of forfeitures, however, would still be within executive control. In what spirit and temper this control would be exercised can be fairly judged of by the past. A year ago, general pardon and amnesty, upon specified terms, were offered to all except certain designated classes, and it was at the same time made known that the excepted classes were still within contemplation of special clemency. In presenting the abandonment of armed resistance to the national authority on the part of the insurgents as the only indispensable condition to ending the war on the part of the government, I retract nothing heretofore said as to slavery. I repeat the declaration made a year ago, that while I remain in my present position, I shall not attempt to retract or modify the Emancipation Proclamation, nor shall I return to slavery any person who is free by the terms of that proclamation or by any of the acts of Congress. If the people should, by whatever mode or means, make it an executive duty to re-enslave such persons, another and not I must be their instrument to perform it. In stating a single condition of peace, I mean simply to say that the war will cease on the part of the government whenever it shall have ceased on the part of those who began it. The country was about to enter upon the 5th year of actual war, but all the indications were pointing unmistakably to a speedy collapse of the rebellion. This foreshadowed disaster to the Confederate armies gave rise to another volunteer peace project and negotiation, which, from the boldness of its animating thought and the official prominence of its actors, assumes a special importance. The veteran politician, Francis P. Blair, Sr., who, as a young journalist 35 years before, had helped President Jackson throttle the South Carolina nullification, who, from his long political and personal experience at Washington, perhaps knew better than almost any one else the individual characters and tempers of Southern leaders, and who, moreover, was ambitious to crown his remarkable career with another dazzling chapter of political intrigue, conceived that the time had arrived when he might perhaps take up the role of a successful mediator between the North and the South. He gave various hints of his desire to President Lincoln, but received neither encouragement nor opportunity to unfold his plans. "Come to me after Savannah falls," was Lincoln's evasive reply, and when on the 22nd of December Sherman announced the surrender of that city as a national Christmas gift, Mr. Blair hastened to put his design into execution. 3 days after Christmas the President gave him a simple card bearing the words, "Allow the bearer, F. P. Blair, Sr., to pass our lines, go south and return. December 28, 1864, A. Lincoln." With this single credential he went to the camp of General Grant, from which he forwarded, by the usual flags of truce, the following letters to Jefferson Davis at Richmond: Headquarters Armies of the United States, December 30, 1864. Jefferson Davis, President, etc., etc. My dear Sir, the loss of some papers of importance, title papers, which I suppose may have been taken by some persons who had access to my house when General Early's army were in possession of my place, induces me to ask the privilege of visiting Richmond and beg the favor of you to facilitate my inquiries in regard to them. Your most obedient servant, F. P. Blair. Headquarters Armies of the United States, December 30, 1864. Jefferson Davis, President, etc., etc. My dear Sir, the fact stated in the enclosed note may serve to answer inquiries as to the object of my visit, which, if allowed by you, I would not communicate fully to any one but yourself. The main purpose I have in seeing you is to explain the views I entertain in reference to the state of the affairs of our country, and to submit to your consideration ideas which, in my opinion, you may turn to good and possibly bring to practical results that may not only repair all the ruin the war has brought upon the nation, but contribute to promote the welfare of other nations that have suffered from it. In candor, I must say to you in advance that I come to you wholly unaccredited, except in so far as I may be by having permission to pass our lines and to offer to you my own suggestions which I have submitted to no one in authority on this side the lines, and will not, without my conversation with you, may lead me to suppose they may lead to something practicable. With the hope of such result, if allowed, I will confidentially unbosom my heart, frankly and without reserve. You will of course hold in reserve all that is not proper to be said to one coming, as I do, merely as a private citizen, and addressing one clothed with the highest responsibilities. Unless the great interests now at stake induce you to attribute more importance to my application than it would otherwise command, I could not expect that you would invite the intrusion. I venture, however, to submit the matter to your judgment. Your most obedient servant, F. P. Blair. Mr. Davis returned a reply with permission to make the visit, but by some mischance it did not reach Mr. Blair till after his patience had become exhausted by waiting, and he had returned to Washington. Proceeding then to Richmond, he was received by Jefferson Davis in a confidential interview on the 12th of January, 1865, which he thoroughly described in a written report, of which we quote the essential portions. I introduced the subject to Mr. Davis by giving him an account of the mode in which I obtained leave to go through the lines, telling him that the President stopped me when I told him I had kindly relations with Mr. Davis, and at the proper time I might do something towards peace, and said, "Come to me when Savannah falls." How after that event he shunned an interview with me, until I perceived he did not wish to hear me, but desired I should go without explanation of my object. I then told Mr. Davis that I wanted to know if he thought fit to communicate it, whether he had any commitments with European powers which would control his conduct in making arrangements with the Government of the United States. He said in the most decisive manner that there were none, that he had no commitments, and expressed himself with some vehemence that he was absolutely free, and would die a free man in all respects. This is pretty much his language. It was his sentiment and manner, certainly. I told him that that was an all-important point, for if it were otherwise I would not have another word to say. I then prefaced the reading of the paper, which I had intended to embody in a letter to him, or present in some form if I could not reach him, or if I were prevented from seeing him personally, by saying that it was somewhat after the manner of an editorial, and was not of a diplomatic character. He replied that he gave me his full confidence, knew that I was an earnest man, and believed I was an honest man, and said he reciprocated the attachment which I had expressed for him and his family; that he was under great obligations to my family for kindnesses rendered to his, that he would never forget them, and that even when dying they would be remembered in his prayers. I then read the paper to him. Suggestions submitted to Jefferson Davis, President, etc., etc. The amnesty proclamation of President Lincoln in connection with his last message to Congress, referring to the termination of the rebellion, presents a basis on which I think permanent peace and union between the warring sections of our country may be reestablished. The amnesty offered would doubtless be enlarged to secure these objects, and made to embrace all who sincerely desired to renew and confirm their allegiance to the Government of the United States by the extinction of the institution which originated the war against the National Republic. Slavery no longer remains an insurmountable obstruction to pacification. You propose to use the slaves in some mode to conquer a peace for the South. If this race be employed to secure the independence of the Southern States by risking their lives in the service, the achievement is certainly to be crowned with their deliverance from bondage. Slavery, the cause of all our woes, is admitted now on all sides to be doomed. As an institution, all the world condemns it. This expiation made, what remains to distract our country? It now seems a free will offering on the part of the South, as essential to its own safety. Being made, nothing but military force can keep the North and South asunder. We see them coming together again, after momentary rupture, along the Ohio, the Mississippi, upon the Gulf, the Potomac, and gradually in the interior, wherever defense is assured from the military power that at first overthrew the government. It is now plain to every sense that nothing but the interposition of the soldiery of foreign tyrannies can prevent all the States from resuming their places in the Union, casting from them the demon of discord. The few States remaining in arms that made the war for slavery as a sine qua non now propose to surrender it, and even the independence which was coveted to support it as a price for foreign aid. Slavery abandoned, the issue is changed, and war against the Union becomes a war for monarchy. And the cry for independence of a government that assured the independence of the Southern States of all foreign powers and their equality in the Union is converted into an appeal for succor to European potentates, to whom they offer in return homage as dependencies. And this is the price they propose to pay for success in breaking up the national government. But will the people who have consented to wage this war for an institution once considered a property, now that they have abandoned it, continue the war to enslave themselves? Would they abandon slavery to commend themselves to the protection of European monarchies, and thus escape the embrace of that national republic as a part of which they have enjoyed almost a century of prosperity and renown? The whole aspect of the controversy upon this view is changed. The patriarchal domestic institution given up, and the idea of independence and being let alone in happy isolation surrendered to obtain the boon of foreign protection under the rule of monarchy. The most modern exemplification of this program for discontented republican states defeating their popular institution by intestine hostilities is found in the French emperor's Austrian deputy, Maximilian, sent to prescribe for their disorders. The design of Louis Napoleon in reference to conquest on this continent is not left to conjecture. With extraordinary frankness he made a public declaration that his object was to make the Latin race supreme in the southern section of the North American continent. This is a Napoleonic idea. The great Napoleon, in a letter or one of his dictations at St. Helena, states that it had been his purpose to embody an army of negroes in San Domingo, to be landed in the slave states with French support, to instigate the blacks there to insurrection, and through revolution effect conquest. Louis Napoleon saw revolution involving the struggle of races and sections on the question of slavery made to his hand, when he instantly recurred to his uncle's ideas of establishing colonies, to create commerce and a navy for France, and to breed the material for armies to maintain his European empire. Jefferson Davis is the fortunate man who now holds the commanding position to encounter this formidable scheme of conquest, and whose fiat can at the same time deliver his country from the bloody agony now covering it in mourning. He can drive Maximilian from his American throne and baffle the designs of Napoleon to subject our Southern people to the Latin race. With a breath he can blow away all pretense for proscription, conscription, or confiscation in the Southern States, restore their fields to luxuriant cultivation, their ports to the commerce of the world, their constitutions and their rights under them as essentially a part of the Constitution of the United States to that strong guarantee under which they flourished for nearly a century, not only as equals, but down to the hour of conflict, the prevalent power on the continent. To accomplish this great good for our common country, President Lincoln has opened the way in his amnesty proclamation and the message which looks to armistice. Suppose the first enlarge to embrace all engaged in the war. Suppose secret preliminaries to armistice enable President Davis to transfer such portions of his army as he may deem proper for his purpose to Texas, held out to it as the land of promise. Suppose this force on the banks of the Rio Grande, armed equipped and provided, and Juarez propitiated, and rallying the liberals of Mexico to give it welcome and support, could it not enter Mexico in full confidence of expelling the invaders who, taking advantage of the distractions of our own republic, have overthrown that of Mexico and established a foreign despotism to rule that land and spread its power over ours? I know Romero, the able, patriotic minister who represents the Republic of Mexico near our government. He is intimate with my son, Montgomery, who is persuaded that he could induce Juarez to devolve all the power he can command on President Davis, a dictatorship if necessary, to restore the rights of Mexico and her people and provide for the stability of its government. With such hopes inspiring and a veteran army of invincibles to rally on, such a force of Mexicans might be embodied as would make the conquest of the country the work of its own people under able leading. But if more force were wanted than these Mexican recruits and the Army of the South would supply, would not multitudes of the Army of the North, officers and men, be found ready to embark in an enterprise vital to the interests of our whole republic? The Republican party has staked itself on the assertion of the Monroe Doctrine, proposed by Canning and sanctioned by a British cabinet. The Democrats of the North have proclaimed their adhesion to it, and I doubt not from the spirit exhibited by the Congress now in session, however unwilling to declare war, it would countenance all legitimate efforts short of such result to restore the Mexican Republic. He who expels the Bonaparte-Habsburg dynasty from our southern flank, which General Jackson in one of his letters warned me was the vulnerable point through which foreign invasion would come, will ally his name with those of Washington and Jackson as a defender of the liberty of the country. If in delivering Mexico he should model its States in form and principle to adapt them to our Union, and add a new southern constellation to its benignant sky, while rounding off our possession on the continent at the Isthmus, and opening the way to blending the waters of the Atlantic and Pacific, thus embracing our republic in the arms of the ocean, he would complete the work of Jefferson, who first set one foot of our colossal government on the Pacific by a stride from the Gulf of Mexico. Such achievement would be more highly appreciated in the South, inasmuch as it would restore the equipoise between the Northern and Southern States, if indeed such sectional distinctions could be recognized after the peculiar institution which created them had ceased to exist. It is of course possible that the hard mental processes in political metaphysics through which Jefferson Davis had forced his intellect in pursuing the ambitious hallucinations which led him from loyalty to treason had blighted all generous sentiment and healthy imagination. But if his heart was yet capable of a single patriotic memory and impulse, strange emotions must have troubled him as he sat listening to the reading of this paper by the man who had been the familiar friend, the trusted adviser, it might almost be said the confidential voice of Andrew Jackson. It was as though the ghost of the great President had come from his grave in Tennessee to draw him a sad and solemn picture of the ruin and shame to which he was bringing, and had almost brought, the American Republic, especially his people of the Southern States, nationality squandered, slavery doomed, and his Confederacy a supplicant for life at the hands of European despotisms. If he did not correctly realize the scene and hour in all its impressiveness, he seems at least to have tacitly acknowledged that his sanguinary adventure in statesmanship was moribund, and that it was high time to listen earnestly to any scheme which might give hope of averting from himself and his adherents the catastrophe to whose near approach he could no longer shut his eyes. Mr. Blair's report thus narrates the remainder of the interview. I then said to him, "There is my problem, Mr. Davis. Do you think it possible to be solved?" After consideration, he said, "I think so." I then said, "You see that I make the great point of this matter that the war is no longer made for slavery but monarchy. You know that if the war is kept up and the Union kept divided, armies must be kept afoot on both sides, and this state of things has never continued long without resulting in monarchy on one side or the other, and on both generally. He assented to this, and with great emphasis remarked that he was like Lucius Junius Brutus, and uttered the sentiment ascribed to him in Shakespeare, without exactly quoting it. There was a Brutus once that would have brooked the eternal devil to keep a state in Rome as easily as a king. Then he said that he was thoroughly for popular government, that this feeling had been born and bred in him. Touching the project, he said, of bringing the sections together again, the great difficulty was the excessive vindictiveness produced by outrages perpetrated in the invaded states during the war. He said reconcilement must depend, he thought, upon time and events, which he hoped would restore better feelings, but that he was certain that no circumstance would have a greater effect than to see the arms of our countrymen from the North and the South united in a war upon a foreign power, assailing principles of government common to both sections, and threatening their destruction. And he said he was convinced that all the powers of Europe felt it their interest that our people in this quarrel should exhaust all their energies in destroying each other, and thus make them a prey to the potentates of Europe, who felt that the destruction of our government was necessary to the maintenance of the monarchical principles on which their own were founded. I told him that I was encouraged by finding him holding these views, and believed that our country, if impressed with them, as I thought it might be universally, would soon resume its happy unity. He said I ought to know with what reluctance he had been drawn out of the Union, that he labored to the last moment to avoid it, that he had followed the old flag longer and with more devotion than anything else on earth, that at Bull Run, when he saw the flag, he supposed it was his own hanging on the staff. They were more alike then than now, and when the flag of the United States unfurled itself in the breeze, he saw it with a sigh, but he had to choose between it and his own, and he had to look to it as that of an enemy. He felt now that it was laid up, but the circumstances to which he had adverted might restore it, and reconcilement be easier. With regard to Mexico, if the foreign power was driven out, it would have to depend on the events there to make it possible to connect that country with this and restore the equipoise to which I looked. Nobody could foresee how things would shape themselves. Touching the matter of arrangement for reconcilement proposed by me, he remarked that all depended upon well-founded confidence, and looking at me with very significant expression, he said, "What, Mr. Blair, do you think of Mr. Seward?" I replied, "Mr. Seward is a very pleasant companion. He has good social qualities, but I have no doubt that where his ambition is concerned, his selfish feelings prevail over all principle. I have no doubt he would betray any man, no matter what his obligations to him, if he stood in the way of his selfish and ambitious schemes. But," I said, "this matter, if entered upon at all, must be with Mr. Lincoln himself. The transaction is a military transaction, and depends entirely upon the commander in chief of our armies. If he goes into it, he will certainly consider it as the affair of the military head of the government. Now I know that Mr. Lincoln is capable of great personal sacrifices, of sacrificing the strongest feelings of his heart, of sacrificing a friend when he thinks it necessary for the good of the country. And you may rely upon it, if he plights his faith to any man in a transaction for which he is responsible as an officer or a man, he will maintain his word inviolably." Mr. Davis said he was glad to hear me say so. He did not know Mr. Lincoln, but he was sure I did, and therefore my declaration gave him the highest satisfaction. As to Mr. Seward, he had no confidence in him himself, and he did not know any man or party in the South that had any. In relation to the mode of effecting the object about which we have been talking, he said, we ought soon to have some understanding, because things to be done or omitted will depend upon it; that he was willing to appoint persons to have conferences without regard to forms; that there must be some medium of communication; that he would appoint a person or persons who could be implicitly relied on by Mr. Lincoln; that he had on a former occasion indicated Judge Campbell, of the Supreme Court as a person who could be relied on. I told him he was a person in whom I had unbounded confidence, both as regarded talents and fidelity. In reply to some remarks that I made as to the fame he would acquire in relieving the country from all its disasters, restoring its harmony, and extending its dominion to the Isthmus, he said what his name might be in history he cared not. If he could restore the prosperity and happiness of his country, that was the end and aim of his being. For himself, death would end his cares, and that was very easy to be accomplished. The next day after my first interview he sent me a note saying he thought I might desire to have something in writing in regard to his conclusion, and therefore he made a brief statement which I brought away. The substantial accuracy of Mr. Blair's report is confirmed by the memorandum of the same interview which Jefferson Davis wrote at the time and has since printed. In this conversation the rebel leader took little pains to disguise his entire willingness to enter upon the wild scheme of military conquest and annexation which could easily be read between the lines of a political crusade to rescue the Monroe Doctrine from its present peril. If Mr. Blair felt elated at having so quickly made a convert of the Confederate President, he was still further gratified at discovering yet more favorable symptoms in his official surrounding at Richmond. In the 3 or 4 days he spent at the rebel capital, he found nearly every prominent personage convinced of the hopeless condition of the rebellion, and even eager to seize upon any contrivance to help them out of their direful prospects. The letter which he bore from Jefferson Davis to be shown to President Lincoln was in the following language: Richmond, Virginia, 12 January, '65. F. P. Blair, Esquire. Sir, I have deemed it proper and probably desirable to you to give you in this form the substance of remarks made by me to be repeated by you to President Lincoln, etc., etc. I have no disposition to find obstacles in forms, and am willing now, as heretofore, to enter into negotiations for the restoration of peace, and am ready to send a commission whenever I have reason to suppose it will be received, or to receive a commission if the United States Government shall choose to send one. That, notwithstanding the rejection of our former offers, I would, if you could promise that a commissioner, minister, or other agent would be received, appoint one immediately, and renew the effort to enter into conference with a view to secure peace to the two countries. Yours, etc., Jefferson Davis. But the government councils at Washington were not ruled by the spirit of political adventure. Abraham Lincoln had a loftier conception of patriotic duty and a higher ideal of national ethics. The proposal to divert his nation, conceived in liberty, from its grand task of preserving for humanity government of the people, by the people, for the people, and degrade its heroic struggle and sacrifice to the low level of a joint filibustering foray, which, instead of crowning his work of emancipation, might perhaps eventuate in a renewal, extension, and perpetuation of slavery, did not receive from him an instant's consideration. His whole interest in Mr. Blair's mission was in the despondency of the rebel leaders which it disclosed, and the possibility of bringing them to an acknowledgment of their despair and the abandonment of their resistance. His only response to the overture thus half officially brought to his notice was to open the door of negotiation a little wider than he had done before, but for the specific and exclusive objects of union and peace. As an answer to Jefferson Davis's note, he therefore wrote Mr. Blair the following: Washington, January 18, 1865. F. P. Blair, Esquire. Sir, you having shown me Mr. Davis's letter to you of the 12th instant, you may say to him that I have constantly been, am now, and shall continue ready to receive any agent whom he or any other influential person now resisting the national authority may informally send to me, with the view of securing peace to the people of our one common country. Yours, etc., A. Lincoln. With this note Mr. Blair returned to Richmond, giving Mr. Davis such feeble excuses as he could hastily frame why the President had rejected his overture for a joint invasion of Mexico, alleging that Mr. Lincoln was embarrassed by radical politicians and could not use political agencies. Mr. Blair then, but again without authority, proposed a new project, namely, that Grant and Lee should enter into negotiations, the scope and object of which, however, he seems to have left altogether vague. The simple truth is evident that Mr. Blair was, as best he might, covering his retreat from an abortive intrigue. He soon reported to Davis that military negotiation was out of the question. Jefferson Davis, therefore, had only two alternatives before him: either to repeat his stubborn ultimatum of separation and independence, or frankly to accept Lincoln's ultimatum of reunion. The principal Richmond authorities knew, and some of them had tacitly admitted, that their Confederacy was nearly in collapse. Vice President Stevens, in a secret session of the rebel Senate, had pointed out that we could not match our opponents in numbers and should not attempt to cope with them in direct physical power, and advocated a Fabian policy which involved the abandonment of Richmond. Judge Campbell, rebel Assistant Secretary of War, had collected facts and figures which a few weeks later he embodied in a formal report showing the South to be in practical exhaustion. Lee sent a dispatch saying he had not 2 days' rations for his army. Richmond was already in a panic at rumors of evacuation. Flour was selling at $1,000 a barrel in Confederate currency. The recent fall of Fort Fisher had closed the last avenue through which blockade runners could bring them foreign supplies. Governor Brown of Georgia was refusing to obey orders from Richmond and characterizing them as usurping and despotic. Under such circumstances a defiant cry of independence would not reassure anybody, nor on the other hand was it longer possible to remain silent. Mr. Blair's first visit to Richmond had created general interest. Old friends plied him with eager questions and laid his truthful answers concerning their gloomy prospects solemnly to heart. The fact of his secret consultation with Davis transpired. When Mr. Blair came a second time and held a second secret consultation with the rebel President, wonder and rumor rose to fever heat. Impelled to take action, Mr. Davis had not the courage to be frank. He called first Vice President Stevens and afterwards his cabinet to a discussion of the project. A peace commission of 3 was appointed, consisting of Alexander H. Stevens, Vice President, R.M.T. Hunter, Senator and ex-Secretary of State, and John A. Campbell, Assistant Secretary of War, all of them convinced that the rebellion was hopeless, and yet unwilling to admit the logical consequences and necessities. The drafting of instructions for the guidance of the commissioners was a difficult problem, since the explicit condition prescribed by Mr. Lincoln's note was that he would only receive an agent sent him with the view of securing peace to the people of our one common country. The astute Mr. Benjamin, rebel Secretary of State, in order to make the instructions as vague and general as possible, proposed a simple direction to confer upon the subject to which it relates. His action and language were broad enough to carry the inference that in his secret heart he too was sick of rebellion and ready to make terms. Whether it was so meant or not, his chief refused to receive the delicate suggestion. With the ruin and defeat of the Confederate cause staring him full in the face, Davis could bring himself neither to a dignified refusal nor to a resigned acceptance of the form of negotiation as Mr. Lincoln had tendered it. Even in the gulf of war and destitution in which he had led his people, he could not forego the vanity of masquerading as a champion. He was unwilling, says Mr. Benjamin, to appear to betray his trust as Confederate President. You thought, from regard to your personal honor, that your language ought to be such as to render impossible any malignant comment on your actions. But if so, why not adopt the heroic alternative and refuse to negotiate? Why resort to the yet more humiliating absurdity of sending a commission on terms which he knew Mr. Lincoln had pointedly rejected? Instead of Mr. Benjamin's phraseology, Jefferson Davis wrote the following instruction to the commissioners, which carried a palpable contradiction on its face. Richmond, January 28, 1865. In conformity with the letter of Mr. Lincoln, of which the foregoing is a copy, you are requested to proceed to Washington City for informal conference with him upon the issues involved in the existing war, and for the purpose of securing peace to the two countries. Your obedient servant, Jefferson Davis. End of chapter 5.